meaning not only a calm mind, but a mind that is abiding single-pointedly on an object. And these two parts of shamatha reflect two slightly different perspectives in this practice. The first is the mind perspective, the perspective of the mind abiding better and better on the object. So this is what we're going to be looking at in this 9-stage model here, that they're called the 9 mental abidings, that the mind is abiding better and better on the object. And so this is the model that's normally used for shamatha, describing the stage of progress of shamatha, particularly by, for example, using the breath as the object. We're trying to abide better and better on the breath. And these 9 mental abidings describe how the mind is abiding better and better on the object. But also we can have this perspective. The event perspective. How are the events in the mind unfolding? And this is normally the perspective that we use for the practice from yesterday, observing the mind. And so when we're using that as the object of shamatha, and we're discussing the stages of progress in that practice, often you won't get this 9-stage model. You'll see a 4-stage model. And in the 4-stage model, it's not so much one, of course, not so much one of the mind abiding better and better on the object, but it's more about noticing how are the events unfolding in the mind. So in this practice we did yesterday, usually the first stage of progress in the practice, stage 1, is described as that there is a waterfall of thoughts crashing down on the mind. That the first stage of progress, what we notice is there's one thought after the other, non-stop, like a waterfall crashing down on us. But if we continue to watch those thoughts and other mental events, then at the second stage of practice, what we will notice that it's more like a fast-flowing river. So there's a lot of thoughts moving quite quickly, but not crashing down as much as before. And then if we continue to observe those thoughts, at the next stage of practice, what we'll notice We'll notice that it's more like a slow-moving river. So there's still thoughts, but they're not so quick now, meaning that we're starting to notice gaps between when one thought finishes and the next thought starts. So more gaps are appearing between mental events, so it feels more like a slow-moving river. And then if we keep watching that, at the 4th stage of practice, the mind will become completely still, so like a still lake or ocean. So these are the 4 stages that are described when we are typically using the mind as the object of practice. That this is what we'll notice in the stages of progress. First, a waterfall of thoughts crashing down, then more like a fast-flowing river, then the amount of mental events starts to slow down, more like a slow-moving river, and then eventually the mind will become very quiet and calm, and it will be like a still lake. No mental events. Mind completely quiet and calm. So that's the model that's often used to describe the stages of progress in the practice we did yesterday. So let's now move on to today's practice. And so today's practice is the object is awareness, or sometimes it's actually called shamatha with no object. Because with the breath, of course, we are aware of the sensations of the breath. And for yesterday's practice, we are aware of the mind and all the mental events. In this practice today, we are simply turning awareness in upon itself and knowing that we're aware. So there's no object other than awareness itself. So that's why it's often called shamatha with no object. Now, many people find this even more challenging than the breath and the mind, not because it's complicated, but because it's too simple. Because this practice, basically it involves doing nothing. We don't know how to do nothing. We always want to do something. So often when this practice is explained, people go, yeah, but what do I have to do? Tell me what I have to do. Doing is the problem. Stop doing, and then you're in the practice. So this practice is more about being than doing. It's simply knowing that we're aware. That's it. So this is what we did towards the end of that meditation, where I said just simply release all appearances, allow the mind to come to rest, not doing anything at all, just be present, knowing that you're aware. That's it. So again, let's just do a little 5-second experiment now, and knowing that we're aware. So starting now. Was that difficult? Did you know you were aware, or did you fall asleep? Not difficult, is it? That's all we got to do. Just know that we're aware. Now, of course, when we're doing this, and we're just knowing that we're aware, of course, all sorts of appearances will continue to rise. Thoughts will still come up, emotions, sounds, sensations in the body, all sorts of things will still come up. But in this practice, we're not interested in anything that appears. We're not trying to block them, but we're not paying attention to them. Let them be there. Sounds, thoughts, emotions can be there. That's okay. We're just not interested in them. Or the only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware. That's it. Now, in that last meditation, I sort of transitioned a bit. First we were observing the mind and the mental events, and then I said, okay, now instead of observing all the mental events, observe the space of the mind itself. Observe the space within which all these mental events are appearing. Just observe that. And then I moved into knowing that we're aware. So you may ask then, well, actually, what's the difference between observing that space and knowing that we're aware? It's the same object, it's still awareness, but experientially, I think it feels a bit different. Experientially, when we give the instruction, observe that space of the mind, we have a sense of being the observer observing that space. So it feels much more dualistic experientially. Whereas when we say, just know that you're aware, it's much more non-dualistic in flavour. There's not a strong sense of an observer observing something other than itself. Now, what are the benefits of this practice? And of course, the goal of this practice, as with the breath and the mind, the goal is shamatha. The goal of this practice is to cultivate a calm, clear, focused mind, to cultivate relaxation, stability and clarity. But what are the side benefits of this practice? So the side benefit, of course, of the breath practice is it helps us to get out of our obsessive compulsive mind. The side benefit of the mind practice is we can become the master of our mind instead of being the slaves of our mind. What's the side benefit of this practice? Side benefit of this practice also is that we can help us to get out of this obsessive compulsive thinking. Because yesterday's practice is we were observing all that mental activity and hopefully not getting caught up in it, but as you probably saw, that's not so easy. So observing it, we still tend to get caught up in a lot of obsessive compulsive thinking. Whereas in this practice, we're not interested in whatever appears, so it's less likely that we'll get caught up in that obsessive compulsive thinking because we're not actually observing those thoughts as we did yesterday. They can be there, but we're not interested in them. So it's much easier, I think, in this practice to disconnect from all that obsessive compulsive thinking. So we can sort of be a bit free of that obsessive compulsive thinking. And also, of course, if we simply rest in awareness, what we notice is awareness is completely still and it's completely open and spacious. There's no sort of boundary to it. And if we rest in that state, we can make that our default mode in daily life. That our default mode can be resting in that open, spacious stillness. Now our default mode in daily life tends to be blah, 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 all day long. That's our default mode. Very difficult to effectively engage in activities while our mind is engaging in this obsessive compulsive thinking. Whereas if we can do this practice, we can start to have our new default mode in daily life, this open, spacious stillness. And that's a much better platform from which to then engage in daily life activities. And another very a good benefit with this practice is that simply resting in that stillness of awareness, knowing that you're aware, we can intuitively come to an insight into the very nature of our own mind. So this is very much a bridge into the Vipassana practice. And I think that once people get the practice and know what the practice is and get into the practice, often people have the experience that it feels like coming home. Because what we're doing here in this practice, in resting in awareness, is we're touching on our true inner nature. And so we can sometimes sense that, we can have that as part of that experience, that we're really starting to touch on our true nature. And so I think that's why people tend to often resonate with this practice, because they can sense that. So let's look at this practice a little bit more detail through Alan Wallace's book here, and then we'll go back into the practice. So this is on page 131. He says the following: if you wish to continue in settling the mind in its natural state, that was the practice we did yesterday, this practice can take you all the way to the achievement of Shamatha. But now I shall present an alternative practice that you may find an even more potent way to balance your attention to perfection. Padmasambhava calls this technique the cultivation of Shamatha without a sign. So Padmasambhava, of course, was the great Indian master from the 8th century who first brought Buddhism to Tibet. In this context, the term sign refers to any object of attention that can be identified within a conceptual framework. The tactile sensations of the breath are a sign. So is the space of the mind and the mental events that arise within that space. In both these practices, the attention is directed to an object other than itself, and stability and clarity are cultivated in relation to that object. In the practice of shamatha without a sign, that's this practice, the attention is not directed to anything. It rests in its own nature, simply being aware of its own presence. Nominally, you could say that awareness takes itself as its object, but experientially, this practice is more a matter of taking no object. You simply let your awareness rest without any referent in its own innate luminosity and cognizance. While Padmasambhava presents this as a method for achieving shamatha, it is also an effective method for illuminating the nature of awareness itself. Or in other words, this practice is also then an effective method for moving into vipassana practice, to realize the nature of the mind itself. And then one more thing here about the practice. So this on page 144, and then we'll go to the meditation. And he says, here are quintessential instructions by Padmasambhava on the practice of shamatha with no object apart from awareness itself. So now he's quoting from a text from Padmasambhava, and he says, vacantly direct your eyes in the space in front of you. So again, as yesterday, the recommendation is to have the eyes open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you. Either have them naturally open or slightly open, as you prefer. See that thoughts pertaining to the past, future and present, as well as wholesome, unwholesome and ethically neutral thoughts, are completely cut off. So cut off here doesn't mean block. Cut off means not engaging in them, not paying any attention to them. Bring no concepts to mind. Let the mind, like a cloudless sky, be clear, empty and evenly devoid of grasping, and settle it into utter vacuity. By doing so, there arises the shamatha of joy, luminosity and non-conceptuality. So again, in this practice, like yesterday, we have the eyes open, resting our gaze in the space in front of you, and we simply rest in awareness itself, simply knowing that we're aware. And whatever appears and arises, not paying any attention to it. Let it be there, it can be there, thoughts, sounds, anything, no problem. We're just not paying attention to any appearance. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware, and just rest in that experience. That's it, that's the practice. So let's do that practice now. Setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. And with each out-breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen, happily releasing them. And allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Simply becoming aware of the rhythm of the breath. with the eyes at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. Simply release all appearances and allow the mind to come to rest. Not doing anything at all. Simply be present, knowing that you're aware. All sorts of appearances will continue to arise, such as thoughts, emotions, sounds, sensations, and so on. But now pay no attention to any appearance. Let them be there. They can be there. We're not interested in them. The only thing we're interested in is knowing that we're aware.